The sterile scent of antiseptics clung to Brian's uniform as he moved down the pristine, white corridors of the medical bay. He was the only human medic on this vast starship, the Ardent Splendor, stationed as a liaison for the sprawling Zairathi Empire. The Zairathi were a tall, silver-skinned race known for their imposing stature and stoic temperament, and despite their initial reluctance, they had come to respect his medical expertise. Yet, Brian was very aware that he was still considered an outsider, a curiosity rather than an equal. His shift had been grueling, and he was just about to clock out when the emergency lights flickered on, flooding the bay in an ominous red hue. An announcement blared through the overhead speakers in the alien language he had come to understand. Critical injury in Bay 7. Emergency team needed. Brian grabbed his med kit and sprinted down the hallway toward Bay 7. When he arrived, he was met with a scene he hadn't expected. Lying on the ground was a Zairathi female, one he vaguely recognized as the royal attaché to General Varan. She was young, maybe in her early 20s by Zairathi standards, with slender features and a pearlescent shimmer to her silver skin. Her long, silken hair fanned around her, damp with blood that seeped from a deep gash on her side. The attending Zairathi medics stepped back as he approached, murmuring in their native tongue. They exchanged uneasy glances, and he sensed their hesitancy, a distrust mingled with an odd form of deference. Ignoring them, Brian knelt beside the girl and examined the wound. "She's lost a lot of blood," he muttered, more to himself, but the Zairathi medics watched intently. The girl's breathing was shallow, her gaze unfocused, but as he applied pressure to her wound, her eyes snapped to his face, piercingly blue and wide with pain and something else. There was a flicker of recognition there, as if she was surprised to see him at her side, touching her, saving her. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe. I'm here to help." She tried to speak, but her voice was faint. He could barely make out her words, though it sounded like she was saying, "I don't want to die." "You won't," he assured her, quickly scanning the medical instruments in his kit. She needed a blood transfusion immediately. Thankfully, he had a small supply of universal Zairathi plasma for emergencies just like this. As he began the transfusion, her eyes never left his face. He focused on stabilizing her vitals, watching as her color slowly returned, her breathing deepened, and the light in her eyes grew less desperate. Once he had done all he could, he motioned to the other medics to lift her onto a stretcher. They murmured their thanks, astonished at the speed and efficiency of his work, but Brian's focus stayed on the girl. She seemed reluctant to let her gaze stray from him, even as they carried her away, until the sight of her disappeared around the corner. Brian hadn't thought much of the incident afterward. He had saved countless lives on board this ship. But a few days later, he was summoned to the observation lounge at the request of the same young woman he'd saved. Her name, he'd learned, was Saphira, daughter of an influential diplomat within the Empire, and she was someone of considerable standing in Zairathi society. He walked into the lounge, surprised to see her already standing there, alone. She wore the traditional deep green of Zairathi nobility, a color that highlighted the luminous silver of her skin. Her injury was well hidden beneath her robe, though he could see she was still slightly favoring her left side. "Medic Brian," she greeted, her voice low and musical. He felt the weight of her gaze, those piercing blue eyes fixed on him as though he were an enigma she wanted to unravel. "Saphira," he said, bowing his head out of respect. "You called for me." She seemed momentarily disconcerted by his directness. "Yes, I wanted to thank you for what you did. I know you risked much in administering such rapid aid. I could have been lost if you hadn't acted." "It was my duty," he replied, offering her a small smile. "I'd have done it for anyone on this ship." Her brow furrowed slightly, but it meant something different to me. We do not have many like you humans on board, and to see one come to my aid, it felt unusual. I am grateful. Brian nodded. He sensed something unspoken lingering in her words, a vulnerability she was unused to showing. "I'm glad I was there for you." A quiet fell between them, neither sure how to bridge the gap between their two worlds. The Zairathi were proud, almost rigid in their self-reliance, and gratitude was a rare emotion to express openly. She broke the silence first. You know, the Zairathi Council doesn't think highly of outsiders meddling in our affairs. I can only imagine what the medics must have thought, seeing you there. I got the impression they weren't thrilled, he said dryly, and a flicker of amusement crossed her face. Yet you saved me anyway. Yes, he replied simply. He didn't add that he'd never turned down the chance to help someone, regardless of species or status. That was just who he was. Would you, she hesitated, as though carefully weighing her next words. Would you consider visiting me in my quarters? I'd like to understand more about your methods about you. Brian blinked, surprised. This kind of invitation was unusual, if not unheard of, but the curiosity in her gaze was sincere, and there was something else there, a tentative warmth that made him think twice. If you're certain it won't raise any issues, then yes, I'd be happy to. She offered a rare smile, one that softened her regal features. Good. I look forward to it. That evening, Brian arrived at her quarters, which were grand and spacious, with walls lined in precious Zairathi silks and low, ambient lighting that cast everything in soft, pearly tones. Saphira stood waiting for him, dressed in a simpler robe, her hair unadorned and cascading over her shoulders. Without the formal trappings of rank, she looked younger, almost vulnerable. Thank you for coming, she said, gesturing for him to sit beside her on a low couch. They spent the next few hours talking, first about medicine, his unconventional techniques, the way human anatomy had developed in parallel to their technology, and how Zairathi medicine often relied on ancient herbal remedies over more invasive methods. But as the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to more personal topics. Saphira seemed eager to learn about his life back on Earth, asking him about simple things like the taste of human food, the way humans celebrated family gatherings, the colors of an Earth sunset. Brian found himself sharing stories of his childhood, his family, and the quiet seaside town he grew up in, details he hadn't spoken of since he'd left for his post here. In return, Saphira told him about her life in the Zairathi Empire. She described grand courts of glittering stone and cascading waterfalls that defied gravity, the solemn ceremonies that bound her to her noble lineage, and the weight of expectations she'd carried from a young age. I'm expected to marry someone of standing, she admitted softly. To further my family's position, it is difficult. The wistfulness in her voice struck a chord in Brian. Here was someone born into a world of privilege and grandeur, yet she was no more free than he was. Their worlds might be vastly different, but there was a loneliness in her words that he recognized, one that resonated with the solitude he'd felt in his own life. He met her gaze, feeling the electric weight of her stare. Saphira, do you ever wish for something else? Her expression softened. Sometimes, yes. Being with you, it reminds me of what it might be like to live outside of these confines, to have a choice. Neither of them moved, yet the distance between them felt as if it had shrunk. A warmth passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Just as he felt himself leaning in, there was a sudden chime from her door. Saphira stiffened, her face returning to the composed mask of nobility. The doors slid open to reveal General Varan, his expression stern. His dark eyes flickered between Saphira and Brian, suspicion evident. Medic Brian he greeted with an icy edge, his gaze narrowing on the human. Brian rose, trying to keep his voice steady. General Varan, I was just discussing medical matters with Saphira. Varan's gaze was a chilling reprimand. Your devotion to your duties is noted, but you would do well to remember your place aboard this vessel. Brian felt Saphira's hand touch his arm lightly, a small gesture of support. General, I asked him here. You needn't worry about his intentions. The general's jaw tightened, but he offered a curt nod. Very well. But Saphira, your father expects you at the Royal Assembly tomorrow. Do not keep him waiting. As Varan left, Brian exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Saphira looked at him, her expression somewhere between apology and sorrow. Perhaps we should be careful, she murmured. He nodded, though his heart sank. Whatever had sparked between them was fragile, tentative, yet he knew it would only grow more complicated. They came from different worlds, different lives, and the risks they faced were now abundantly clear. But as he left her quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling of her gaze on him, a warmth that lingered, like a promise in the darkness. The days following that night weighed heavily on Brian. He threw himself into his work, hoping to keep his mind from straying back to the warmth of Saphira's quarters, the quiet conversations they had shared, and the way she'd looked at him. But he couldn't ignore the way her memory tugged at him, no matter how hard he tried to focus. He had known, even then, that something unspoken had changed between them. 2 weeks passed before he saw her again. Brian was treating a young Zairathi soldier in the med bay when a shadow fell over him. He looked up to find Saphira standing there, her expression carefully composed, though her eyes held a quiet urgency. "Can we speak?" she asked softly, glancing around. He nodded, finishing up his work and giving a quick nod to the Zairathi medics. She led him down a side corridor to a quieter, hidden part of the ship. Here, away from the prying eyes and stern gazes of her people, her expression shifted, and she allowed the guarded mask to fall away. "There's something you should know, Brian," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father, he has begun to notice how often I've been inquiring about you, seeking your company. He suspects something." Brian felt a cold stab of worry. "What does that mean, Saphira? Are you in danger?" "It's complicated." She looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "He expects my loyalty, not only as his daughter but as a Zairathi of noble blood. To him, a human," as she hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "Let's just say he would find my interest in you unacceptable." Brian reached for her hand, a small but defiant gesture. "Saphira, if you're in any danger because of me, I can leave. I'll request a transfer off the Ardent Splendor." "No," she said quickly, her fingers tightening around his. "I don't want you to go. These past weeks, they've been some of the only moments of peace I've ever known." Brian felt his pulse quicken, and he sensed the depth of her words. She hadn't just been seeking his company, she had been seeking freedom, the chance to be herself. And he, in his quiet humanity, had become her way to feel that. "But what can we do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She drew closer, her gaze meeting his. "There's a diplomatic gathering tomorrow on the orbiting moon of Kurath. My father has invited me to attend as his representative, though I have a different plan in mind." Her eyes flashed with resolve. "Come with me. There's an outpost on Kurath. If we can reach it, I can arrange for us to take a ship far from the Empire's influence. Somewhere where no one would care that we care for each other." Brian's mind reeled. She was asking him to leave, to risk his own life, his career, all for a chance to be together. But the thought of parting from her now, of losing what he'd found, felt impossible. "When do we leave?" he asked, his voice steady. Her relief was palpable, and she managed a smile that softened the tension in her face. "Tomorrow, after the diplomatic gathering. I'll find you." The next day passed in a blur of preparations. Brian made sure to pack only the essentials, carrying medical supplies, emergency rations, and a single, small holocube with memories of Earth family pictures and recordings he treasured. By nightfall, he was waiting in the quiet shadows near the docking bay, his pulse racing. Saphira appeared shortly after, dressed in a simple cloak that hid her features. Her hair was pulled back, and her expression was set with grim determination. "Are you ready?" she whispered. He nodded, joining her as they made their way to a shuttle bound for Kurath. She passed through the security checkpoint without a hitch, her rank allowing her to bypass most inspections. As they boarded, he took one last look at the towering starship that had been his home for so many months. The journey to Kurath was brief, and they disembarked on the moon's surface under the cover of darkness. They slipped through the outskirts of the diplomatic quarters, weaving between rows of towering stone columns and gilded statues of Zairathi leaders. Finally, they reached a remote path that led away from the crowded area. "This way," Saphira murmured, leading him down a twisting trail. But just as they reached the mouth of the hidden outpost, a voice echoed behind them. "Going somewhere, Saphira?" They spun around and Brian felt his heart drop. General Varan stood at the end of the path, his expression unreadable but his eyes filled with contempt. Behind him were two heavily armed Zairathi guards, their hands resting on their weapons. Saphira stepped forward, squaring her shoulders. Let us go, General Voron. I have no intention of bringing dishonor upon my family, but I will not live a life they've chosen for me. Voron's expression hardened. This human has twisted your mind. He has no place among us. You would throw away everything, your status, your heritage, for him. Saphira's gaze did not waver. Yes, because he saved my life, not only in the medical bay but every day since. He showed me a life I never thought I could have. Voron's hand moved to the weapon at his side. Then, I'm afraid I have no choice. The guards moved forward, weapons drawn, and Brian's instincts took over. He surged in front of Saphira, shielding her. If you want her, you'll have to go through me. Voron laughed coldly. A human challenging me? Brave, but foolish. But Saphira's hand closed over Brian's arm, a surge of energy passing between them. Her voice was calm, yet full of determination. You underestimate him, Voron, and me. In one swift movement, she drew a concealed Zairathi blade from her cloak, catching the guards by surprise. She moved with a fluid grace that stunned even Voron, cutting one guard's weapon from his hand and disarming the other in a heartbeat. Brian took advantage of the moment, grabbing the dropped weapon and turning it on Voron. They stood, breathing heavily, facing the general as he struggled to reconcile the scene before him, the noble daughter of the Empire, allied with a human, defying her own people. Saphira, don't do this, Voron said, his voice laced with fury. This path will lead you nowhere. You'll be hunted by the Empire, by your own family. She met his gaze, unwavering. I'm willing to take that risk. This life, this future, I choose it. I choose him. Voron's face twisted in rage, but he held up a hand, signaling his guards to stand down. His expression was one of cold fury, but something like respect flickered briefly in his eyes. Very well, Saphira. But know this, your decision will not be forgiven easily. You are marked now, both of you, he turned, gesturing for the guards to follow, his voice low. You may have escaped tonight, but the Empire will never stop looking. As they watched him vanish into the darkness, Brian felt the weight of her hand on his. He turned to find her watching him, her eyes filled with relief and the slightest hint of fear. We have to move, she said, and he nodded, guiding her toward the hidden outpost. They found an old Zairathi transport vessel waiting in one of the hangars. Saphira quickly overrode the access codes, and they boarded, taking their seats in the cramped cockpit. As the engines hummed to life, Brian took one last look at the moon's rocky surface, knowing this was truly the point of no return. Saphira took the controls, guiding them through a series of evasive maneuvers as they broke free of Karath's atmosphere. The ship lurched as they entered the vast darkness of space, leaving the Zairathi territory behind. As they slipped into the quiet hum of faster-than-light travel, Saphira relaxed her grip on the controls. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. Thank you, Brian. For everything. He smiled, brushing a lock of her silvery hair behind her ear. I'd do it all again for you, Saphira. They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of what they had done settling over them. There was no going back to the lives they had left behind. They were fugitives now, bound by a shared fate. Where do we go from here, she whispered. He took her hand in his, their fingers intertwining. Wherever we want. As long as we're together. A small, genuine smile broke across her face, lighting up her eyes. And in that moment, as the ship drifted through the endless stars, they felt the quiet freedom they had both longed for. Together, they would find a place beyond the Empire's reach, a world where they could carve out a life for themselves, a place where a human and a Zairathi could be free to choose love over duty, and destiny over legacy. Their journey was just beginning, but they faced it together, unafraid of what lay ahead.